Picture two people, same title, same tenure, they have the same track record, but one of them gets a text from the VP the night before the big presentation. Hey, want to run something by you before tomorrow. The other one finds out what was decided when those slides go up in the presentation. Now, that person isn't seen as less capable than the other. They're not. They're probably just as smart, just as experienced as the person who got the text. But somewhere along the way, they became the person who executes decisions instead of the person who influences them. And nobody sent them a memo about that, as it usually happens. Most professionals don't realize that this is happening until they've been on the wrong side of it for probably longer than they'd like to admit. This is an influence problem, and it has nothing to do with your title. Welcome to Control Your Career. I'm Julia Toothaker, your strategic career consultant, and I'm so glad that you're here. This season is all about career leverage, how your career evolves once you have credibility, once that's established, and you are ready to be strategic. In the last episode, we talked about reputation. So if you haven't seen that episode, highly recommend you go check that one out, probably before you watch this one or listen to this one. But this episode is going to be all about influence without the formal authority, which is something that I know a lot of us have dealt with. Either we are that person or we've watched that influence happen with other people. We're going to look at how influence forms, why it has nothing to do with your title usually, and what gets in the way of it, including things that aren't always in your control. So let's get into it. Authority and influence are not the same thing. I'm sure most of you that have been in the working world for a while understand that. A title is what is going to give you authority, but it does not guarantee that anybody is going to actually listen to you. People listening to you, that's the influence. I think there is a level of influence when it comes to the title, but it's really because authority is more structural. And so people assume that you have more influence, and sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. But influence is really relational. So that explains some of the leaders that while they have a title, they can't really get anybody to do anything versus somebody on the team who doesn't have the title, but can get people to move and make things happen. I think it's interesting when we look at authority, some people really struggle with authority. They struggle in terms of they get it and they don't know what to do with it. And it's because they've likely been put into that position prematurely, or it's been a situation where they weren't 100% sure what they were walking into. So this happens a lot when organizations bring in a leader externally, and that leader is not known to the organization or to the team that they are leading. So that person has authority, they have a title, but they have no influence. And so there's a level of influence that has to be built, right? They have to build that trust. We're going to talk about that more in just a minute. But they have to build all of these things before the team is going to trust them. So in those initial stages, it really is blind trust and blind loyalty and blind influence in a lot of ways, because that person is coming in with the title, but they haven't built those relationships. And that's where you end up getting a lot of pushback usually. And so when people come into this leadership title, sometimes it can be hard for them to acclimate because they realize that there are other people influencing what is going on. There are other people that have influence over the team, and you have to figure out who those people are. Now, that doesn't just happen if you are external and brought into an organization. This can also happen internally. You've heard me talk about situations where I've been on a team and I was pulled into other other conversations, even though I was not the leader of that team, but I had a level of influence that people respected. And so that was something that I was able to do. Right or wrong, these are things that happen. These are things that happen when you have been able to prove yourself. So, one of the goals that I want you to think about in your career, if this is something that matters to you, right? We're talking about controlling your career, we're talking about career influence and leverage. And if you want all of those things, you have to think about influence. So the goal is not to wait for the title. Okay. So many people wait for the title. And yes, the title is helpful, but you need to be building that influence long before the title comes. Okay. So we want to start thinking about this now. Okay. So I want to give another example just to make sure that we're driving everything home. So this episode is going to have a lot of examples in it because I think a lot of you have lived some of these examples. And so you understand what I'm talking about. So think about this. On your team, your manager announces a decision. Okay. Decision has been made about whatever it is. Usually it's some kind of technology that nobody wants. I digress. So a decision has been made. Everybody follows the decision because they have to, right? Something has happened, a decision has been made, you have to follow it. That is authority. That is your manager saying this decision was made up here at the higher levels, or I made this decision because it's what's best for the team in conversations with other people, and you have to follow it. That is authority, manager to employee. But someone on the team might raise a risk, let's say. They might talk about something that they see potentially going wrong that nobody had considered. And then that person maybe has a conversation with the manager, maybe has a conversation with somebody else, and now the plans have changed. That employee, that team member that brought up that issue and had those additional conversations, that is influence. That is somebody who can see beyond what they're doing, or sometimes are so good at what they're doing that they see the impact that it's going to have more broadly, and they're bringing it up immediately. Now, that can backfire on you. I have recently seen that happen. Unfortunately, that can absolutely backfire on you because not everybody wants that information. So you have to know the room. You have to read the room. You have to understand the players. You have to understand the situation. That is also a point of influence. Your ability to read the situation, and does it make more sense for you to bring something up to the group, or does it make more sense for you to go have some strategic conversations to make sure that what you're thinking is the right thing and then go have a conversation with the manager? So there's a lot of different ways that you can build influence. Some of it is what works best for you, but also it's what works best for the situation. And that is where strategy comes in. That's where being a more strategic thinker about your situation and those around you is going to be really helpful in building that influence. Now, a hard question for a lot of people is, are you in the room? Right? Influence means that you have to be within the proximity of the decisions that are being made. So are you in the room when those decisions are being made? You want to be brought in to the conversation. You want to be brought in at a point where you can have the right level of influence for what is going on. You don't want to be told later. So you want to think about, am I in the room when I need to be in the room? And sometimes people will leave you out of the room intentionally. Sometimes side conversations will happen. Like, there's a lot that goes into this that can be a little manipulative sometimes, but also can be very strategic if you understand what's going on. You have to understand that being informed about something and being told that this is what's going to happen is very different than being somebody that is consulted about what is going to happen. When you are consulted, it means that you are trusted. It means that your opinion, your thoughts, the way that you see your team, the organization, what you do, people see you be strategic. You've built that trust, and now you're not just being asked to execute on decisions, but you're being brought in because they see, oh, this person, they're the one that actually is going to be able to see where we might need extra support or where there's going to be a gap or whatever the case may be, right? When leaders pull people in early, especially people that maybe you don't think should be in the room, that's usually a sign that they believe that that person's input will improve the outcome. And I think there are situations where we see this happen and you have like your direct team of people working on something and your manager or maybe, the leader over your section, they bring somebody in from another area. And you wonder to yourself, why is this person being brought in when this is a team issue? And sometimes it's because that person has a different perspective. And that person is doing something that maybe you know or you don't know that can influence the project that you all are about to do. So when I was working full time and I was in higher education, we had a lot of situations like this where we were doing different initiatives and we needed to bring people in because if we didn't get their buy-in early, it made it harder for us to execute on whatever we were doing. So even though we maybe had a plan already, we knew that there were some key people of influence that would help us push the initiative forward. And we wanted them to be in the conversation, even if they didn't quite understand why they were there, or there were other people that didn't quite understand why we brought them in. So that's also a way to be influential, right? So like you are somebody that has influence in other areas and they want you to be a part of that conversation. Now, this can also be a problem because if you are somebody of influence, if you are the person that gets called into things, you can get overloaded very quickly, especially on small teams or in smaller organizations where you just don't have as many people to pull from. You're going to have a couple of really strategic minds that get pulled into everything. And then that can be a drain sometimes, or it can prevent them from actually doing the things that they were hired to do. So you have to make sure that there is a balance there, but also you do want to be that person to an extent. Now, again, if you are somebody who just wants to show up, do your job, execute your job and go, that's fine. This probably isn't for you, right? These strategies are not for you. These strategies are for when you want to be known, you want that influence, and you want to continue to grow within your career. This is what is going to help you do that. I think it's also important to note when it comes to influence, it's not just your opinion, but it's your judgment. And it's the consistency of that judgment. So if you have been able to prove yourself over and over again based on what you've brought to the table, things that you've brought up, all of that, then people are going to start listening to you, right? So consistency and trust, those are two of the main things that you need as a professional in order to really create that influence. And so you want to think about how you're doing that. And sometimes earlier in your career or even in mid-career, you have to build that up. So it's not just going to be, oh, like, let me talk about this because I have expertise in that. Sometimes it's giving an opinion after the fact, or it's being able to analyze what happened and talk about it in a way where managers and leaders go, oh, okay, I see your perspective. I see where we could have done something different. And if you weren't in the room, you wouldn't have been able to show that perspective. And so that is then a signal to them to say, hey, we need this person in the room next time because they were able to connect all of the dots here. So that is what I want you to think about. So one story that I want to share that I think illustrates this really well is something that happened to me when I was working. And I had been in the organization, I had been in the larger organization in a different area, but it was a very, I would say, higher profile position and very influential. So I had a really interesting view of the organization from this previous position. And then I got hired in another department. I had not done the work in this department before, and I was learning and all of that, and it was good. I loved it. But about, I want to say it was maybe 6 months in to me being in this new area, I got called in to one of the leaders that was over our department to talk about a situation. And it was funny because I remember being very confused about why I was brought into this conversation. And so they are explaining everything to me, and I stopped her and I said, "Hey, like, I love that you brought me into this, but why did you bring me into this? I have only been here for 6 months in this position with this team. Why aren't you bringing in this person or this person?" And the look that I got, I will never forget. It was very much a, you know why. You know why. And I was like, okay, fair. I understand. However, this isn't my position. I don't feel comfortable being called in on this discussion when I do not lead this area. And I really appreciated her feedback because she said, you know what? I hear you. You might not be the leader, but you have the best judgment and you have the most influence. And so this is something that I wanted to bring to your attention because I think that the positions that you have previously held allow you to understand what I'm talking about on a different level. And I was like, okay. And so anyway, we ended up, having a conversation and it was fine. But that was one of those times for me in my career where I went, oh, I think that I have more influence than I think that I do. Unfortunately, at that time, I did not know how to use it. So that's a different story. But you want to think about those times in your career where you were called in, where were you brought in when it comes to decisions? Are you being brought in the earlier stages because people value you? Or are you being told what the decision is and you're being asked to execute on it? I want to talk about trust. I mentioned it earlier. Let's dig a little bit deeper into it because trust really is going to be the foundation when it comes to influence in your career. People do not take your perspective seriously unless they trust your judgment. We've talked about judgment too. There has to be a high level of trust somewhere. And trust is something that I think is really interesting because we all have different gauges for it. But in the workplace, it's usually going to be built through consistency. And again, you've heard me say this over and over again because it's so important to influence. So it's going to be built in what you are doing consistently, how you are viewing the organization, how you are looking at problems, how you are analyzing what is going on. And when that is consistent and people understand who you are and what you stand for and all of that, that's when you have now built trust. I got to a point in my career, especially as a coach, where when the staff got to know me and they understood who I was as a coach, they were able to send specific people to me because they knew, oh, you need to meet with Julia. She's the one that has the right skill set for you, right? And there were other people on our team that were better for other people, so that's the kind of influence that you want. You want people to understand who you are. And that happens in more of those micro moments, I would say. And I think a lot of people think, oh, so and so was on this big project or they landed this big account, and that's cool. Like, landing a big account, completing a big project, those are really major things that you do in your career and it adds to it. But honestly, it's not really going to be those big moments. I think some people do value the big moments more, but there has to be consistency there. So yes, you landed a big client, but are you landing other clients or is it just the one client? Is it just the one client and that's going to carry you for the next 6 months, right? And so what about the person that maybe landed 10 clients and that is building up, right? And you see the consistency in how they work with others. So I'm not trying to put down, getting the larger clients. That is obviously very important. But I think when we're talking about like influence within the workplace, it's going to come with that consistency. It's going to come with building the reliability that you're going to be able to do this over and over and over and over again. And I think one of the gaps within the workplace, and specifically when we talk about promotions, which I know we've talked about a lot this season, but one of the gaps is when you have leaders who value the big moments over the little moments. And then when those people get into promotions and all of that, sometimes they can't deliver because the consistency isn't there, right? And so to me, it's better, not to say you can't land the big accounts, but it's better to build consistency in whatever you're doing in order to have that longer term influence and have somebody say, hey, this person is consistent. They are doing it. And I think that they're ready for that next thing, right? I think this is also just knowing your organization, knowing what your leaders value and being able to deliver on that in a way that's going to get you to where you want to go. So this is always going to be multifaceted. Even though I break things down, there's always going to be a lot of different things that are going to play in to all of this, right? Something else that I think builds trust but can backfire. Okay, so double-edged sword here is admitting when you're wrong about something or admitting when you have made a mistake and really owning it. For some people, you can get fired over that. I've had that happen to clients before. For other people, it just puts a stain on your position. Your manager sees you differently, and that's out of your control, right? We all make mistakes at some point. The gravity of that mistake is going to look different depending on the organization, the leadership, you, all of that. I have found that people who have more influence can generally make more mistakes, but not careless mistakes. So this is more, something happens, they made the wrong judgment call on this one thing, but overall their judgment is very consistent, or something externally impacted a situation. It was outside of their control. So they admit, hey, this happened. I didn't handle it well. We weren't expecting it, whatever the case may be. I think owning that is really helpful because it shows like, hey, I'm not deflecting. I'm owning what happened. I'm owning what went wrong. But again, read the room because you have to understand when and where that's going to be appreciated and where that can potentially work against you. So it's not always going to be a positive thing, but I think probably more earlier in your career when the mistakes aren't as big, they're little things that you make here and there. I think that's when you can really do that well without any kind of major consequence. And so that's what you want to think about is just being able to say, hey, I was wrong. Here's what happened. I understand now. Here's what I'm going to change in the future. And then something else that builds trust but also erodes trust is overpromising. So I see this happen so much with people who don't trust themselves a lot in their position, or they're trying to impress somebody. And so they overpromise on what they can do in their position, what they can do on a project, all of that. And the problem with that is if you overpromise and underdeliver, now we have an issue, right? You're going to lose influence because you're not meeting the goals. You're not saying what you said that you were going to do. And so, honestly, in most cases, and I think most people would give this advice too, you really want to underpromise. As much as possible, you want to underpromise and overdeliver because that, again, is going to build trust. And what can you do to maybe go the extra mile on something if you have time, just to show, hey, I'm doing a little bit more because I think that that's the right thing to do. That's how we're building the trust, and the trust creates that influence. Now, I know some of you are going to say, I feel like I do this almost every episode. Some of you are going to say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go the extra mile. I don't want to do any of what you're saying. I love that for you. This episode is not for you. I am not for you. So that is part of you discerning where you're at in your career. People that want to do the next thing, people that want to go somewhere and grow and have this advancement in their career, they're willing to go the extra mile. And that's what I'm talking about here, is really building the influence and being able to do that. Okay. So a reflection question I have for you around trust is this. If you proposed a change tomorrow, how much resistance would you face? And is that resistance about the idea or about the track record behind it? So, what are we getting at there? We're getting at, where is your level of trust on the team? So if you went into a team meeting and said, I want to propose this change, are people going to be behind you? Are people going to understand what you're talking about? Or are you going to be hit with a lot of resistance? And if you are hit with a lot of resistance, is it about the situation and the project, or is it about you? And that is something that, when you have to come to terms with it as a professional, sometimes can be really hard, because that's when you realize you don't have the influence that you think that you have. Now, there's a lot of reasons to push back on people, so I'm not going to get into all the depth of that, but this is more of a high level. If you were walking into this situation, what would happen? Okay, I want to take just a little bit of a pause here, because this next section that I'm going to talk about, I think, is going to make some people uncomfortable, but we have to talk about it when we are talking about influence. This is also something that I am unpacking a little bit in my book, and I have been writing about, and is something that is very important to me, because I want to make sure that people understand the impact that they have and the influence that they have, whether or not they believe that they have it. And I want to normalize some of the situations that people have been in, myself included, and be able to really think critically about the situations and the work environments that we are in. Influence is filtered through context and power. All right. This is going to be a topic that I know some of you are going to push back on, and I hope that you listen, because this is something that we all need to understand in terms of dynamics within the rooms that we are in. Influence is going to look different in every organizational environment. The same behavior is going to be interpreted completely different depending on who's in charge, who's in the room, the department, the team, the organization. All of these things are going to influence the power dynamics in the room and across the organization. So one environment that works for one person might not work for another person, or they're going to experience it differently because of the culture and because of the power dynamics that are going on. A lot of this is attributed to organizational culture. Organizational culture, a lot of times, is driven by leadership and how leadership views everybody, what they value, all of that. Now, that doesn't mean that your team doesn't have a different culture than the broader organizational culture. That can absolutely happen. I see that all the time. So you have to understand the different dynamics. You have to also understand what happens when certain people come into the room, right? Some ideas are going to get ignored, and then other ideas are going to get praised because it was the person that was giving the idea. These power dynamics happen in all organizations. And some professionals, they have to really demonstrate their credibility repeatedly before their input is going to be taken seriously. But even then, you might have somebody that you know is extremely influential, but there is something about them that somebody else doesn't like or doesn't respect or doesn't value. And that person's voice gets held down in whatever space that you're in. It's usually in a meeting of some kind, right? I know you all have seen this happen, and for some of you, it's probably happened directly to you. So this can be gender, it can be race, it can be age, it can be seniority. These are all things that are happening in a room. Think about a situation where you have an intern who gets to sit in on a meeting, fresh eyes, they've never been in here before. Nobody expects them to speak. And in some cases, they may have been told not to speak, depending on the organizational culture. However, they might feel very strongly about a situation that's being talked about, and they have good reason to add value into the conversation, and they decide to speak. And everybody listens and then dismisses them because they're an intern. And then 10 minutes later, somebody higher up says almost the exact same thing that intern says. And everybody's like, yes, that's the thing. Of course it is. I know we've all seen that happen in some way. Sometimes it's not as blatant as that, but sometimes it happens behind closed doors a lot. So an intern has a conversation with the manager takes that idea and runs with it, but never attributes it to the intern. I have seen that happen more than I can count. So you want to think about these power dynamics, because this is part of what influences influence. It's understanding who holds the power, understanding what those dynamics are going to look like and what is valued within your organization, whether or not you agree with it, which is something else we'll talk about in just a second. The other example that I want to give you, and this is something that has happened to me repeatedly in my career, and ironically is something that is the reason people hire me now, but I digress. I want you to think about being in that meeting environment, and you have a male colleague who is very direct about an opinion they have about something that is happening. Direct to the point that you almost are taken back by their directness and the tone and bite in their voice. And that person, that gentleman, is seen as assertive. That's the label that they get. Oh, he was assertive in the meeting to get his point across. But then the female colleague at the other end of the table also has a very strong opinion, maybe in contradiction to the gentleman's opinion, and very calmly says what her opinion is, but is also very direct and very pointed, but never raises her voice, gets loud, or anything like that. Just direct. And that person, that female colleague, is seen as aggressive. Same-ish behavior. I would say the man was probably more aggressive in my example, and the woman was just stating her opinion very directly. But he was seen as assertive and she was seen as aggressive. I have been there. I have been told that I am too aggressive. I've been told that I'm too direct. I've been told that I don't sandwich things well. And I'm fully convinced that it's not only because I was a woman in a space predominantly with men, but I am also very tall. And that is something that I'm very aware of that really freaks people out for some reason. So these are things that some of us are living with every day, having to navigate, and that impacts our influence. Because now that female colleague that has been labeled as aggressive might not get the promotion because now there's this perception that she's aggressive instead of being assertive. Now, I know some of you are going to say, oh, I know the difference. I get it. We've talked about, great. I love that. Make sure that you're advocating in the spaces that you're in. Make sure that you are standing up for the people who are being labeled inappropriately because of whatever worldview people are coming from or whatever culture, toxic culture that has been built. Okay? And here's the thing, you cannot control every factor about how you're perceived, okay? I can do everything and still be called aggressive because I'm almost 6 feet tall and that intimidates people. Like, I can be the softest version of myself and it still might not be enough. So you cannot always control how you are perceived, but you can assess the environment as best you can to understand what's going on. And I think the people who are able to assess environments well are the ones that are able to navigate through them well. Doesn't mean that they're not being treated poorly, because they probably are, but they at least understand what's going on and they can make the adjustments, right? That assessment of your environment and the people around you, that's what needs to inform your strategy, your career strategy. The ability to control your career comes from that, because sometimes it's the environment and sometimes it's the people in that environment. And if you were to go have the same conversations in a different group, in a different organization with a different team, you might not have any issues. And so that's some of what I want you to think about as you're thinking about power dynamics within your organization. Okay. So a couple of reflection questions for this that I think is helpful, especially when you're trying to navigate through some of this when you know that it's an issue. Is the feedback that you have received consistent across different managers, or has it been shifting depending on who's evaluating you? So if you think back through your career, are there consistencies, right? I've always been told that I'm direct. I know that. But there was an environment shift that I had. I switched organizations. That was no longer the feedback that I received, but I had received it multiple times in a different environment. And that for me was the sign that I was in the wrong type of organization for a long time. And so it allowed me to think about organizational type a little bit differently. So I want you to think about that. Is this consistent, or is it just this person that thinks this way? Because if it's just this person, it might be their own bias. And that's a different issue for you to have to work through. And then I think this is most important when you have really well thought out human resources, which doesn't always happen, but we hope. Are you being evaluated against very clear standards or personality expectations? So a lot of times, organizations that have really good review processes, they have things laid out very, very clearly. And so you can see what you're doing. You can see, where you've succeeded in something, where there's a gap, all of that. The ones that don't have that sometimes will go back into personality expectations. And I think that's too where if you do have some clarity in standards and you're still getting your personality held against you, you could push back on that when it's appropriate. Sometimes the feedback has to be there, but again, it all completely depends on your situation. So when we're talking about influence and power dynamics, this is something that is going to be part of the conversation. And for some of you, it's going to be a more important part than others. So make sure that you understand what that looks like for you in your situation. Okay, I want to talk about expanding your influence without politics, which can be hard. It can be very hard because politics within organizations is always going to play a role in influence to some extent, but we do want to try to work around that when possible so that the influence you're building is really credible influence. So remember, influence is about contribution. It's about clarity. People understand who you are. Yes, there is a level of positioning that might need to happen. I would say that's a little bit more reputation, which we talked about in other episodes. Influence is really more about you're doing your job well and you're showing up a certain way and people know that. So it's not always who you know, but that can be a little bit of it. But I'm going to harken back to the beginning. Influence isn't about authority. It's not about the title. If you feel like you need a title to get things done, then you do not have influence, right? And so you want to be the person that everyone goes to for the solutions separate from that title. And I think that's how you're working within the organization without having to play the politics. Playing the politics is appeasing somebody else, right? That's the like, oh, that person's kissing up to this person, or you happen to have a connection, which, we usually recommend, but sometimes it's not great. So you want to think about building something different than let me strategically position myself. That's a different strategy. So influence is really solving problems. You want to solve problems that are beyond your immediate job description. So you might notice something. Maybe you're in a cross-functional team and you're noticing a gap somewhere. That's where bringing up solutions is really helpful because now you're thinking beyond what you're doing. And that thing might influence you, that gap might influence your position, but your ability to see across an organization, that's part of what builds influence, right? So you offer perspective. So when you're working on a project, like let's say you're doing an update for a project, it's not just, okay, here's where we are and here's what happened. Like, yes, we need that. But it's also, here is where we're headed. Here's what we think we're going to need. Here are potentially some of the issues we could encounter. And so you're thinking beyond what's going on and you're thinking about if we want to get here, this is the support that we need. So it's understanding how to build a case and really, again, create influence within your position. I've mentioned this before so much in this season, but building those cross-functional relationships when it makes sense. It doesn't always make sense for the team, the position, the organization, depends on the size. There's a lot of things, but anytime that you can build relationships outside of your immediate team is so helpful. I think for most organizations, this happens in onboarding where you are introduced to people that you might interact with. But I would go farther and say, hey, I'd like to meet people on these different teams, whether or not you think you're going to interact with them, just to have a broader understanding of what's going on in the organization and hear other people's opinions, because that might help you at some point understand your position or your team situation different. Remember that building this influence It's not just about execution of what you're doing. And again, this is something we've been repeating throughout this episode, but also throughout this season. When you get stuck in execution, it makes it really hard for you to build influence outside of yourself. So your influence is really about that judgment. So you want to have really good judgment in the situation that you are in. And our reflection question for this section: where could your perspective improve a decision that's currently outside your job description? So I want you to think about that over the next week or two when you are brought into different discussions or you hear about different things happening. Earlier in this season, we talked about compounding your career. We talked about what makes a career compound. Things compound over time. So influence is part of that. Influence is something that compounds over time. As you develop it, it is something that will grow very, very quickly. And this is where earlier I talked about you can get kind of burnt out and overwhelmed if you're brought into too many conversations. But, that's not necessarily a bad thing if that's, the role that you like to take. But the more that you do this, the more that you become this person that people value and they trust your opinion, the more that's going to compound and the more opportunities you're going to have. So you want to make sure that you are building that throughout your career. And I would say too, there's a lot of seasons with this. So we have some seasons where our heads are down and we're working and, we're going towards something. And there's other seasons where maybe there's a little more building going on and we are in those conversations a little bit more. And I think it's being very aware of what's going on. So one thing to think about when it comes to compounding is some of the things that we have previously talked about that help create the influential compounding. So skills. Your skills are going to strengthen your judgment because you are informed, you know what's going on, you're an expert in the thing that you are doing. And your reputation is going to shape how you are perceived. How do people view you? And that's a trust building piece as well. So reputation and influence go together significantly. And so when we think about putting skills and reputation together, that's the bridge to create really, really strong influence. You have to have both of those. And I think sometimes people think that their reputation is going to be the thing that carries them through, and it can, but there is almost always a plateau if they can't build the skills quickly enough. So sometimes somebody's reputation will take them through the ranks and they stop building skills, they tap out and they leave or they get fired because they can't actually execute and do the job, right? But if you are somebody that has a really strong reputation and you recognize that you have to build the skills along with that, and you're able to marry those two together, now we're building the influence. Now we're building that trust, even if the reputation has carried you to a certain extent, right? We've talked about perspective and we've talked about judgment. And I want you to really evaluate for yourself how often you're having those conversations, even if it's after the fact, even if it's after something has happened and you are recounting or thinking about what you would do different next time. Those conversations are part of what helps to build the trust, especially with a manager, because now that manager is understanding how you think and they're seeing that you are analytical about situations and you're able to make connections that maybe other people aren't able to make. So when that happens, you're planting a seed for that manager to then pull you into a conversation earlier, right? And that is the ultimate goal, is we want to be brought in to the conversation. We want to be brought in before the decision actually happens, right? So, a reflection question that I want you to ask yourself is, if people hear your perspective more than once, does it tend to reinforce trust or create hesitation? I asked something similar earlier in this episode. You can see this is important. It's you being able to read how people are responding to you. That is so core when we are trying to control our career, right? When we are trying to create this larger career leverage, we have to be able to read the room. And that hesitation can sometimes come from what you do in the organization and how much others know about you. So, this is a little bit of the caveat when it comes to hesitation. If you are known to have an ulterior motive because of different initiatives that you might be a part of, they might think that you're trying to manipulate a situation to your advantage. And so this is where sometimes you're being called in and you have an opinion, but there's hesitation because people know who you are and where your influence lies. So this can absolutely work against you. So you have to understand the room, you have to understand the people, you have to be able to say, hey, I'm part of this. And because of that, I have this perspective. So I would say if that's a situation, own it, but also be very weary of unintentionally manipulating people because you definitely don't want to do that. So remember, influence does not require a new title. We don't have to get a promotion to start building this influence to hopefully get us to the promotion eventually. You need consistent judgment, credibility, and visibility in the right conversations. If you want your career to evolve without starting over, that's the main thing. You want this growth, but you don't want to blow it up and you don't want to start over. Influence is one of the most powerful forms of leverage available to you. So this week, I want you to pay attention to decisions that are being made. Are you in those conversations early or are you receiving directives after the fact? And if it's the latter, you have to ask yourself, is this a skill issue, a trust issue, or an environment issue? Because that answer, that's going to influence what you do next and how you move forward. Next episode, we are going to talk about sponsorship and access. This is how influence turns into real access when somebody advocates for you in the rooms that you aren't in. If this helped you think more strategically about your career, make sure that you are subscribed or you follow the show. My goal this season is to help resource you as best as I can. So I have included past episodes and different career resources that I offer in the blog post for this episode. So go ahead and check those out. I will see you next time. And remember, you control your career.